The forest was quiet that evening. The kind of quiet that settles in after something bad has already happened. No birds. No wind. Just the sound of dead leaves pressing flat under the weight of cold air. The clan had moved on hours ago. There had been no argument, no long goodbye. The elder had simply looked at the young Drake, shook his head and turned away. The others followed without a word. That was how it worked in the clan. If you could not keep up, you were left. It had always been that way. The young Drake had tried. He had pushed his small legs as hard as they would go. He had ignored the pain in his left wing, the one that had never healed quite right after the fall 2 seasons ago. He had told himself he was fine, that he could manage, that they would slow down. They did not slow down. By the time his legs gave out, the sound of the clan was already gone. He could not hear their wing beats, could not smell their fire. There was nothing around him but tall dark trees and the slow creep of cold coming down from the mountains. He crawled a little further. Not because he thought it would help. Just because stopping completely felt like giving up, and some part of him was not ready to do that yet. He made it maybe 20 steps before his front legs folded and he went down hard into the mud at the edge of a dirt road. He lay there. His breathing was shallow. His scales, which should have been a warm amber color, had gone pale and dull from the cold. The bad wing was pressed flat against his side. His eyes were open but heavy, and the world around him had started to blur at the edges. He did not make a sound. He had learned early that making sounds when you were weak only brought more trouble. So he stayed quiet and still, and he watched the dark road in front of him, and he waited for whatever came next. What came next was a cart. It was a simple thing. Old wood, one tired horse, a pile of cut logs stacked in the back. The man holding the reins was not large or impressive in any way. He had a plain face, rough hands, and a coat that had been patched at the elbows more than once. He was not a soldier. Not a hunter. Just a farmer heading home before dark. His name was Roy. Roy almost did not see the Drake at all. The road was dim and his mind was elsewhere, going over the list of things that still needed doing before winter settled in properly. Firewood. Roof patch over the east corner. Talk to the miller about the grain. Then the horse stopped. Roy looked up. The horse was standing still with her ears pressed flat, staring at something on the side of the road. Roy followed her eyes and saw the shape in the mud. For a moment he thought it was a log or maybe a dog that had been hit by something. He climbed down from the cart slowly. He got closer. And then he saw the wing. Roy stopped walking. He stood very still and looked at the small Drake lying in the mud, and the Drake looked back at him with eyes that were too tired to be afraid anymore. Roy had heard stories about Drakes his whole life. Everyone had. Big creatures, proud and dangerous, traveling in clans through the deep forest. You did not bother them and they did not bother you. But this one was small. Young. Maybe not even fully grown. And it was alone, which was the thing that made no sense to Roy. Drakes did not travel alone. Drakes did not collapse in the mud at the edge of dirt roads in the middle of nowhere. He stood there for a long moment. The smart thing was to get back on the cart and keep moving. It was almost dark. Faye would be waiting. The fire would need wood. A Drake, even a young one, was not his problem. He knew that. He crouched down anyway. He did not reach out right away. He just crouched there at a careful distance and looked at the creature properly. The wound on the side was not fresh. It had been bleeding slowly for a while. The wing was held wrong, pressed too tight against the body in the way that meant pain. The mud around the Drake was disturbed, little trails of it, like the creature had been trying to crawl somewhere and had finally run out of strength to try. Roy let out a long breath through his nose. He looked back at the road ahead. Empty. He looked at the trees. Nothing moving. He looked at the horse, who was still standing with her ears flat and her eyes on the Drake. Then he looked at the Drake again. The creature had not moved. Had not hissed or pulled back or shown teeth. It was just lying there, watching him with those pale, tired eyes, and Roy had the strange feeling that it was not afraid of him anymore. Not because it trusted him, but because it had simply run out of energy to feel anything at all. Roy stood up. He went back to the cart and pulled the old blanket from under the seat. He folded it once and walked back slowly, keeping his steps quiet and easy. He crouched down again, closer this time. He spoke in a low voice. Nothing important. Just soft words to fill the silence. Then, as gently as he could manage, he slid his arms under the small Drake and lifted. The Drake did not fight him. Roy carried him to the cart, laid him down carefully on the blanket between the logs and climbed back up to the seat. He clicked his tongue and the horse started moving again. The road home was not long. But for the young Drake lying in the back of that old cart, wrapped in a worn blanket and listening to the steady clop of hooves on cold dirt, It was already the furthest he had ever traveled from the place where he had been left behind. The house was small but warm. Roy pushed the door open with his shoulder, careful not to jostle the Drake in his arms. The fire inside was still going, just low, the kind that needed a log or two but was not out yet. The smell of cooked broth hung in the air. Something on the stove. Something simple. Faye was at the table when he walked in. She was a plain woman with tired eyes and quick hands, the kind of person who noticed things before they were said. She looked up when the door opened, ready to ask about the logs, and then she saw what Roy was carrying and the question died in her throat. She stood up slowly. Roy did not say anything right away. He carried the Drake to the fireplace and lowered him down onto the rug as gently as he could manage. The Drake made no sound. Just lay there on his side, breathing in small careful pulls, eyes half open and watching the fire like he was not sure if it was real. Faye had not moved from beside the table. Roy straightened up and looked at her. She was staring at the Drake with both hands pressed flat on the tabletop, and her face was doing several things at once. Surprise. Worry. Something that was almost fear but not quite. Roy said found him on the road. He was alone. Nobody with him. Faye said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "That is a Drake, Roy." Roy said yes. She said, "You brought a Drake into the house." Roy looked at the creature on the rug. The pale scales. The bad wing. The slow breathing. He said he was in the mud. By himself. He would not have made it to morning. Faye looked at the Drake for a long time. Then she went to the kitchen. Roy let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. He pulled his stool close to the fireplace and sat down near the Drake, not too close, just close enough to see him properly. The wound on the side was worse in the firelight. Not deep enough to be the end of things, but bad enough that it needed cleaning. Roy got up and found a clean cloth and a bowl of water. He worked slowly. He wet the cloth and pressed it to the wound with light hands, stopping whenever the Drake flinched. The Drake flinched several times but never pulled away, never showed teeth, never made the low warning sound that Roy had heard Drakes make in the stories. He just lay still and endured it, watching Roy's face the whole time with those half-open eyes. Roy talked while he worked. Not about anything important. Just the farm. The horse. The way the cold had come down from the mountains earlier than expected this year. He was not sure why he talked. Maybe because silence felt wrong. Maybe because the sound of a calm voice seemed to help, even if the creature could not understand the words. Faye came back with a bowl. She set it down a few feet from the Drake and stepped back. In the bowl were scraps of meat from the evening's broth, some pieces of bread, and a smaller bowl of warm water beside it. She stood with her arms crossed, not out of coldness, but out of the careful way a person stands when they are not sure what is going to happen next. The Drake looked at the bowl. He did not move right away. He just looked at it, then at Faye, then at Roy, then back at the bowl. Like he was trying to understand what it meant that food had simply been placed in front of him without anything being asked in return. Roy said softly, "Go ahead." The Drake stretched his neck slowly and lowered his head to the bowl. He ate in small careful bites. Not fast. Not desperate. Just quietly, like a creature who had learned that good things could be taken away and did not want to draw attention to the fact that he was having one. Faye watched him eat. After a while she uncrossed her arms. She came and sat on the other stool near the fire, not far from Roy, and the three of them stayed like that for a while. The fire popped. The Drake finished the meat and rested his chin on the edge of the bowl. His breathing had evened out. The worst of the shivering had stopped. Faye said quietly, "What will you call him?" Roy thought about it. He looked at the Drake's scales, pale and washed out from the cold, but with something underneath that color, something that in better light might have been a warm gray, like the ash at the bottom of a good fire. He said ash. Faye looked at the Drake. Ash looked back at her with those slow, tired eyes. She reached out, very carefully, and rested 2 fingers on the top of his head for just a moment. The Drake did not move. Did not pull back. She pulled her hand away and stood up to check the stove. Roy added a log to the fire. Ash lowered his head to the rug and closed his eyes. His breathing was slow and even now. His bad wing had relaxed slightly, no longer pressed so tight against his body. The room was warm and quiet, and the fire threw soft light across the floor. Nobody in the clan had ever simply let him rest. There had always been something to prove. Some distance to cover. Some standard he could not quite reach no matter how hard he tried. But here, in this small house, with a farmer and his wife moving quietly around him, nobody asked him for anything at all. He was asleep before the next log caught. It started with the miller. He had seen Roy's cart come back that evening later than usual, and had noticed the shape under the blanket in the back. He had not said anything that night. But the next morning he mentioned it to the blacksmith, and the blacksmith mentioned it to his wife, and by midday the whole village knew that Roy had brought something home from the road. By the following morning they knew it was a drake. The mood changed fast. That was the thing about small villages. News did not travel slowly and it did not arrive quietly. It came all at once, loud and already decided, and by the time Roy stepped outside to feed the horse, there were already 3 men standing at his fence with their arms crossed. He looked at them. They looked at him. Roy said good morning. Nobody said it back. More came as the morning went on. Not all at once but steadily the way clouds build before a storm. Men from the farms nearby. Women from the market road. The miller standing near the back with his thick arms folded. The blacksmith beside him. A few of the younger men near the front, the ones who always stood near the front when there was something to be angry about. By the time the sun was properly up, there were maybe 20 people outside Roy's fence. Alan was at the front. Alan was Roy's nearest neighbor. He was not a bad man, not truly, but he was the kind of man who worried loudly and expected others to worry with him. He had a loud voice and a long memory and he did not like things that fell outside of what he already understood. He called out to Roy across the fence. He said, "We know what you have in there. We know what you brought home. And we are telling you, Roy, it cannot stay. A drake in the middle of a settlement is not something we will allow." Roy was standing on his front step. He had his coat on but had not bothered with his hat. He looked at Alan, then at the crowd behind him, then back at Alan. He said, "He is hurt. He is young. He is not doing anything to anyone." Alan said, "Not yet." Someone in the crowd said, "They travel in clans. You bring one here, the whole clan follows." Roy said he has no clan. He was alone on the road. Left there. That brought a moment of quiet. Not the kind that meant people were thinking differently. Just the kind that meant they had not expected that particular fact and needed a moment to push past it. Then someone else said, "Does not matter how he got there. What matters is where he is now. And he cannot be here." Roy looked at the crowd for a long moment. He was not an angry man by nature. He did not raise his voice easily and he did not enjoy arguments. But there was something solid in him, the kind of solid that does not move just because a lot of people are pushing. Faye had always said that about him. That when Roy made up his mind about something, the ground shifted before he did. He stepped off the front step and walked to the fence. He stopped on his side of it and looked at Alan directly. He said, "He is on my land in my house and he is not well enough to be moved. That is the end of it." Alan said, "Roy, be reasonable. We have children in this village. We have livestock. A drake, even a young one, is not a pet. You do not know what it will do when it is stronger." Roy said, "I know what he did last night. He ate some scraps and he went to sleep. That is all." Alan said, "And when he is not tired anymore? When he is healed and strong and decides he wants something this village has?" Roy said, "Then we will deal with that if it comes. But I will not put a sick creature back in the cold because of something that has not happened and might not happen." The crowd stirred. Some voices rose. Someone near the back said it was not right. Someone else said Roy was putting the whole village at risk for an animal. The miller said something about drakes and fire that Roy did not fully catch but that got a few nervous nods. Roy did not move from the fence. He did not argue with each voice. He did not try to calm everyone down or explain himself over and over. He just stood there, hands easy at his sides, and waited for the noise to settle. Then he said, clearly and without heat, "I found him alone and hurt and I brought him home. I am not asking for your permission and I am not going to change my mind. If anyone has real trouble with Ash, they can come speak to me about it, one at a time like adults." Then he turned and walked back to the house. He did not look back. The crowd stood at the fence for a while longer. Alan said a few more things. Some people nodded. Some people drifted away. The younger men near the front looked at each other like they were deciding whether to do something and then decided not to. Eventually the fence was empty. Inside the house, Faye had been watching through the small window beside the door. When Roy came back and she looked at him and then looked at the floor near the fireplace where Ash was still lying, awake now, watching the door with quiet, steady eyes. She said, "He heard all of it." Roy looked at Ash. The drake looked back at him. Roy said, "Good. Then he knows nobody here is going to move him." He hung up his coat and went to put the kettle on. They came at dawn. The sound reached the village before anything else did. A low, heavy beat in the air, the kind that you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. Birds scattered from the trees at the edge of the forest. The horses in the yard pulled at their ropes. Dogs that had been sleeping flat on cold ground were suddenly on their feet, ears up, facing the tree-line. Roy was already awake. He had slept lightly that night the way he sometimes did when something in the air felt off. He was in the yard pulling on his coat when the first shape came over the trees. Then another. Then 3 more behind that. 5 drakes. Full grown. Wide wings cutting slow circles in the pale morning sky. They landed at the far edge of the village road, one after another, heavy and deliberate. The ground shook faintly with each landing. The largest one came down last, in the center, and folded his wings with the slow ease of something that had never once worried about what it was walking into. That one was the elder. He was old. You could see it in the way he carried himself, not weak but settled, the way very old things are settled. His scales were deep gray with patches of darker color along the neck and shoulders. His eyes were pale and sharp, and they moved over the village the way a man's eyes move over something he is deciding the value of. Doors in the village stayed shut. Windows had faces behind them, but nobody came out. The road between the elder and Roy's house was empty and quiet except for the sound of the wind moving through it. Roy came out of his gate alone. He had not brought anything with him. No tool. No weapon. He walked up the road in his patched coat with his hands open at his sides, and he stopped maybe 10 feet from the elder and looked up at him without looking away. The elder looked down at Roy for a long moment. Then he spoke. The voice was low and carried easily, the kind of voice that did not need to be raised to fill a space. He said, "There is a young one here. He belongs to our clan. We have come to take him back." Roy said, "He is not here." The elder's pale eyes did not change. He said, "We can smell him, human. He is in that house behind you. Do not waste my time with words that are not true." Roy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are right. He is in the house. What I meant was, he does not belong to your clan anymore." The elder said, "That is not your decision to make." Roy said, "With respect, you made that decision yourselves." The elder said nothing. Roy said it plainly. He said, "You left him in the forest. Alone. Hurt. In the cold. He could not keep up, and so you walked away from him and did not look back. I found him on the road that night, in the mud, with no strength left. He would not have seen morning." The elder said, "That is the way of the clan. The weak do not hold back the strong. It has always been this way." Roy said, "Maybe so. But you cannot leave something and then come back for it when you decide you want it again. That is not how it works." The elder took one slow step forward. He was very large up close. His shadow fell over Roy completely. He said, "You are one man. And you are telling a clan elder what he can and cannot do." Roy did not step back. He said, "I am telling you what is right. You can disagree with me if you want. But you left him. You walked away. Whatever he was to your clan before that moment, he stopped being it when you left him in the mud to die. You do not get to reclaim what you threw away." The silence that followed was long. The other 4 drakes had not moved. They stood where they had landed, watching. The elder looked down at Roy with those pale sharp eyes, and Roy looked back up at him, and neither of them moved. Then something shifted in the elder's face. Not anger. Not agreement either. Something harder to name. The look of something very old that has just heard a true thing said out loud and does not know what to do with it. He said, "And if we take him anyway?" Roy said, "Then you take him. I cannot stop you. But everyone here will know what you are. A clan that left one of their own to die and then came back for him when it was easy. That is not strength. That is something else." The elder looked at Roy for a long moment more. Then he looked past Roy at the house. Just for a second. And in that second Roy thought he saw something move behind those pale eyes, something that might have been the smallest edge of shame, there and then gone so fast it was hard to be sure. The elder turned. He said one word to the others, low and short, and they opened their wings. One by one they lifted off the road, heavy and slow at first and then rising fast, beating up over the trees and turning south without looking back. The elder went last. He did not look at Roy again. Roy stood in the empty road and watched them go until the sound of their wings was gone and the birds had started coming back to the trees. Then he turned and walked back to the house. Faye was at the door. She said, "Is it done?" Roy said yes. He went inside. Ash was sitting up near the fireplace, fully awake, watching the door. Roy sat down on his stool and the drake looked at him with those quiet, steady eyes. Roy said nothing. He just reached out and rested a hand on the top of Ash's head for a moment. That was enough. The days after the clan left were quiet. No more faces at the fence. No more voices on the road. The village went back to its usual sounds, the blacksmith's hammer, the miller's wheel, the slow creak of cart wheels on cold dirt, and Ash remained in Roy's house near the fireplace, healing in the way that young things heal when they are finally allowed to rest. The wing took the longest. Roy had straightened it as best he could in those first days, wrapping it with strips of clean cloth and checking it each morning. Ash sat still through all of it. He did not fuss. He did not pull away. He simply watched Roy's hands with those steady eyes and endured whatever needed to be endured without complaint. Faye said once that Ash had better patience than most men she knew. Roy said that was not a high bar. Faye threw a cloth at him and Ash watched the whole thing with what Roy had started to think of as the Drake's version of quiet amusement. He could not be sure. But there was something in the way Ash's eyes moved during moments like that, something soft and attentive, like a creature storing away small warm things for later. By the third week Ash was standing on his own. By the fourth he was moving around the yard, slow at first, favoring the bad side but steady. Roy watched him from the fence each morning without making a fuss about it. Just watched. The same way he watched the fields after planting, not willing the thing to grow, just keeping an eye on it, being present. The village changed slowly. It did not happen all at once. It never does in small places. But it happened. The miller's youngest was the first. A small boy named Pete who had somehow slipped away from his mother one afternoon and ended up at Roy's fence staring at Ash in the yard with enormous eyes. Ash had looked back at him. The boy had not run. After a moment Ash had lowered his head slowly to the fence rail and the boy had reached out one small hand and touched the top of his nose. That was all. But the miller heard about it that evening and said nothing more about drakes in the village after that. The blacksmith came by a week later. Not to complain. Just to look. He stood at the fence for a while and watched Ash move around the yard and then said to Roy that the creature was smaller than he had expected. Roy said yes. The blacksmith said nothing else and walked back to his shop. But the next morning he left a cut of good meat on Roy's fence post without a word. Roy left it for Ash. Alan was the last. He came on a gray afternoon when the first real snow of winter was just beginning to fall. He stood at the gate and Roy came out to meet him and they looked at each other the way two men look at each other when one of them needs to say something and is taking his time getting there. Alan said, "I was not wrong to be concerned." Roy said, "I know that." Alan said, "But I was wrong about him. I can see that now." Roy said, "Yes." Alan looked at Ash, who was sitting near the barn wall out of the snow, watching them both. He said, "He is calm." "I did not expect that." Roy said, "He has always been calm. He just needed somewhere safe to be it." Alan nodded slowly. He did not stay long. But when he left he raised a hand to Ash as he went through the gate. Ash watched him go with those quiet eyes. That was the end of the trouble. Winter settled in properly after that and the village moved into the slower rhythms of the cold months. Ash stayed close to the house, helping where he could in the ways that a young drake could help, carrying things Roy would have had to make 2 trips for, keeping the yard clear of the foxes that came sniffing around the chicken coop at night. He was good at the nights. He did not sleep the way Roy and Faye did. He dozed in short stretches and was alert between them, and more than once Roy came out in the gray early morning to find Ash sitting at the edge of the yard looking out at the fields with his wings folded and his breath making small clouds in the cold air. Roy would stand beside him sometimes. Neither of them would say anything. Roy did not speak Drake and Ash did not speak the language of farmers. But they had built something between them that did not need words. The kind of understanding that comes from shared mornings and quiet work and the steady presence of someone who does not leave. Faye made a place for Ash in the barn when the cold got deep. Thick straw, a heavy blanket, the lantern kept low for warmth. Ash slept there on the bad nights and was at the kitchen door in the mornings waiting when she came out with the day's first scraps. She always brought extra. She never made a thing of it. One evening in the deep middle of winter Roy sat by the fire with Faye across from him and Ash lying between them on the rug, asleep, the bad wing resting easy now, the pale scales warmed amber by the firelight. Faye said quietly, "He is not what I expected." Roy said no. She said, "I am glad you stopped that night." Roy looked at Ash for a moment. The slow rise and fall of the drake's breathing. The ease of it. The simple fact of a creature that had been left to die now sleeping warm and safe on a rug by a fire. He said, "Someone had to." The fire crackled softly. Outside the snow fell without a sound. And inside that small warm house, with no clan and no bloodline and no old story to explain it, a family sat together and simply was.